Everyone. We are very happy to have here with us Dr. Michał Panasiuk from Warsaw University. Michał Panasiuk works as a professor at the Department of South Asia, Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Warsaw. He gives courses on modern Bengali and lectures on Bengali literature and other aspects of South Asian culture. His research focuses on the poetics of Middle Bengali texts written between the 15th and 19th centuries in the area of today's India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. He is particularly interested in Bengali manuscripts, the problem of distribution and reading or receiving literary texts before the introduction of printing in Bengal. He is also interested in Muslim authors writing until the 19th century. He is currently working on a book on the 18th century poetics in Bengali literature, which, as he has just said to me, he's still working on. So we hope it to be published in the next years. Today he's going to talk to us on the art of Bengali poetry in the 18th century, Annadamangal, but by Bharatchandra Rai Gunakar. Welcome, Michał.
Thank you very much. I hope we are such a small group here, so I really like it because it always makes it very informal, and I like the connection that we always have with few people who come and want to listen to us. But first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the director, Professor Jimenez, for invitation. I'm just visiting Mexico. So I'm very happy that I found that Asian languages and literature and culture is taught here, and you have an amazing place, and I'm really happy to meet everybody here. And I'm happy to present something that I'm working on and show you what I do in my research. I was schooled in South Asian studies in Europe, in Warsaw, emphasizing mostly on languages and literature. I studied Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi, and Urdu. But over the years, Bengali became my main topic of research, and that's what I concentrate on last 15 years now. And today I would like to discuss the poetry, a little bit of the 18th century Bengal. So we will travel to the most eastern sides of Indian subcontinent where Bengali is spoken. And the main title of my presentation that I sent to the organizer, you can see it's The Art of Poetry in the 18th Century, Annadamangal by Bharatchandra Rai Gunakar. But there is also a second title that I like more, and it's a longer one, that's why I haven't sent it to the organizers. So how two queens try to lure the king to their chambers, the worried king makes a choice, and in between frolics delivers a lesson on poetics. So that's the funny and interesting thing I'm going to talk about today. So generally still on the art of poetry in the 18th century work. As I will discuss literature created long time ago, I think it's necessary to start with a very short introduction, and I hope I will not bore you with that, to Middle Bengali literature. When I do my research, I try to understand how the literature was read or performed and perceived by the audience it was created for. And I find it very essential to know who were the receivers of the literary work. The literature of each period gives us a picture of literary and cultural sensibility that's always different and that changes, sometimes fast, sometimes slower, but it changes. So I tend not to read each work of Middle Bengali in the same way. I try to focus where it was written, for whom it was written, and why it was written, who were the receivers of the work. And a few essential factors must be understood and recollected repeatedly when we work on pre-modern Bengali literature. And these are something that you can see on the screen. that Bengali, Middle Bengali literature, so pre-modern Bengali literature, and when I refer to these terms, I always think about literature that was created prior to 19th century. Okay, this work I'm going to discuss today, actually, it's one of the last biggest example of Middle Bengali literature. It's actually closes the period, and by many is known as the last big work of Middle Bengali literature, and also the first work of modern Bengali literature. So we have to always remember that Middle Bengali, pre-modern Bengali literature, was always written in a verse. It was always written for a particular audience. It was written without standardized grammar. And usually, in most cases always, it always comes with a musical notation. And that's the point we tend to forget while reading it, because this literature was never read. At least what we can think of, most probably, in most of the cases, it was always performed, not read from the manuscript. There are many misconceptions about the image of Middle Bengali literature. One of the most popular are that all the Middle Bengali literature is based on Sanskrit poetical theories, that Middle Bengali literature is based on Hindu themes only, that Middle Bengali literature has only one source of inspiration, that's Sanskrit literature, and was only created on the territories of Bengali-speaking communities. One of the most neglected areas of Bengali studies are works composed by Muslim authors and works written in Bengali, but not in a Bengali alphabet. Without them, our picture of the literature is partial, narrow, and one-sided. It's also good to remember that Middle Bengali appears to be a significant supra-regional idiom in Eastern South Asia, from Nepal to Arakan, so today's Myanmar. Literature written in any form of Bengali before 19th century was created in verse, as I told, accompanied by music, read aloud or sung. And this kind of literature was never meant for solitary reading as much, so something that our Western perceptions gives us about, forces on us when we think about literature, that we sit and we read. No, it's a different case with Middle Bengali literature, not only Bengali, of course, at that time. So I want you to remember when we talk about this literature, when I talk about different issues, that it was always heard, not read. Not always, but I think in most of the cases. So, okay, let's stay here. I will make a short introduction of the poet and the poem before we go to the main part. So the poet that I'm going to talk about today, Bharatchandra Gunakar, is a very fascinating figure, especially since he is one of the few representatives of the pre-modern literature about whom, as many scholars claim, we have much information. And we should be very happy about that we have so many information about Middle Bengali writer. But there is one problem that we forget about. All the information that we have about this poet came from two sources only. One being the text itself, and the second is a biography of the poet written 100 years ago by 100 years after the death of the poet by Ishwar Chandra Gupta, that you can see on the screen right now. This is the only existing story for the picture, but it's the only existing picture of this person. And you can see also the main page of the book I'm talking about, Kobi Jiboni. And this put us, researchers, in a very challenging situation. Can we trust two sources or even one source and take it as the truth? In his poem, Bharatchandra gives us some basic information on his backgrounds, and he does it accordingly to the literary tradition of the period. So he gives it at the end of the text of each palas in bhanitas, chapters or parts of his work. He introduces his father, his place of birth. At one point, he introduces his children, just the names. And that's all. That's what we get from one source about the poet. And of course, he mentions the patron, but nothing more personal about himself. All the other information that we have about this poet is given by this person, Ishwar Chandra Gupta, 100 years ago after the poet's death. Who was this person and what kind of information he left to us? He was also a poet, and as a poet he was involved in developing a 19th century school of poetry in Kolkata, trying to recreate and encourage the development of the school of poetry based on a very traditional patterns. So he was not the only one who was revolutionizing poetry in 19th century Kolkata. He was from the more rigid, more traditional line. He wanted the poetry to be still based on a very traditional patterns that were already going away with the influx of Western literature, of course. So for him, for Ishwar Chandra, it meant he took the style of Middle Bengali language, of Middle Bengali literature, as a reference point. That was the main idea. And of course, he wanted to introduce contemporary artists to models worthy of imitation. And the ideal candidate for this was our poet, the court poet, hailing from a place not far away from Kolkata. He was living and working at the court around 100 kilometers away from Kolkata, so not very far away, and who created quite outstanding work not very distant in time. So it was around 100 years difference. So Bharatchandra fitted perfectly into the project that Ishwar Chandra wanted to make. And Ishwar Chandra, based on research, and this research was actually interviews, published in 1855 a work called Kobi Jiboni, The Life of the Poet. That first page you can see on the screen, which is still, till now, the main source of the poet's life. Gupta is saying in his introduction that he got all the knowledge from the poet's grandson, apparently. Bengali researchers generally put a date of birth of Bharatchandra between 1705-1712. The most popular modern edition of the work from Bongio Shohitya Porishad, this is like a literary organization, and the edition was done in 1943, takes the year of 1712 as the proper date of birth of our poet, and usually scholars follow this date. But there are some who disagree with that, and we usually have this 1705-1712. But everybody agrees, and I don't know why everybody agrees on that Bharatchandra died in 1760, and this date is never actually questioned. What we learned about the poet from the Gupta, the story is very fascinating. It's like reading a novel and shows how turbulent times the poet lived in. So Bharatchandra, apparently, so I'm going to tell you what we get from the source, not what I think about what's true, but what the story tells us. So Bharatchandra apparently came from a Brahmin Kulin family, settled in Bhurshut, in a village called Pedo. His father was a zamindar, or Raja, zamindar who bore the title of Raja, Narendra Narayan Rai. And this is the name we get in the work I'm going to talk about you today. So Bharatchandra gives the name of his father, so we know it's the right name. His father was supposed to have insulted the mother of Maharaja of Bardhaman, that was neighboring state within the Bengal. And as a result of this insult, Maharaja of Bardhaman sent an army, took Bharatchandra's father's house and land, so they were left with nothing. Bharatchandra, as a young boy, already showed very good linguistic abilities, and he wanted to study Sanskrit. The family was not very happy, even though he was Brahmin Kulin, that he studied Sanskrit, because Persian, that was language of administration at that time, was more profitable from the economical point of view. and the family was left with nothing. So the idea of the family was, okay, we have a prodigy son, let's send him to study Persian, not Sanskrit. And when we think about those years, not only in Bengal, but I think we Indologists tend to forget about it. We always forget about this Persian. It's always somewhere in the background. But at the end, it was really the language that was used at the courts. It was the language of the etiquette. It was also the language of literature. We can say, okay, it was the language of literature. Why don't we have the books translated from that period? Exactly, we don't have them because nobody takes care and nobody goes to the libraries to translate those manuscripts that were written. And poets of that time had inspiration from works written in Persian because they knew Persian. Every educated person should know of that time. If he wanted to have connection with the court, of course, of Nawab. So for economic reasons, the poet, as a young boy, is sent to learn Persian by his family. He travels to the teacher's house. We have a name, Ramchandra Munshi, that was given by Ishwar Chandra. And probably while studying there, Bharatchandra creates his first work, short piece, in which he already plays with literary tradition. It's a little different poem than traditionally. Poet already includes different meters, and he used not one but three languages that he mixes up: Bengali, Hindustani, and Persian. So usually it's not about the grammar, it's more about the vocabulary he uses. During this time, as a student, he also marries, and against the will of his family, apparently, a girl from the nearby village. But as they are young, they don't live together, and when he goes back to the family, when he finishes his education, she stays at her father's place. After returning to his family, he is drawn into dangerous games with the court of Bardhaman, so the court of the Raja who attacked before the family of Bharatchandra. And as a result, the poet, who was actually kind of sent to negotiate something with the family of Bardhaman, is arrested. He manages somehow to escape the arrest, the jail, and he escapes out of the Bengal. He leaves his family and he goes to Orissa. And Orissa during this time was ruled by Marathas. Marathas who used to actually destroy and attack Bengal for many years when poet lived, and poet actually writes about Marathas in his poem. So he was in Puri, and in Puri he became ascetic. There is a mention of saffron robes in Shankara Math, and he takes different name, Muni Gonshai. At one point, we don't know after how many years, he and his companions, ascetics, they go to the pilgrimage to Vrindavan, holy place for Vaishnavas. On the way, somewhere near, so they travel via Bengal, and they travel close to Krishnanagar, the place that will be very important in future, so the capital of the Nodia Zamindari, Nodia kingdom. Somehow he meets his wife's sister or cousin. And probably that was the intervention of his parents-in-law who were looking for him because the girl was left alone, which resulted in the poet's return to his wife's family. So the poet is not ascetic anymore. He comes back from his life as ascetic. He returns to the family of his wife, and now he needs to provide for his family. We don't know how old he was during that time. Nobody mentions that. So to earn some money, to put it simply, he is going to Chandanagar. That was a French enclave in Bengal that time, very important, seeking the protection of the Divan. So the ruler of that area, Indra Narayan Chaudhuri. He introduced the poet to king or Zamindar Krishna Chandra. The story says that the king asked the poet to come to visit him at the court in Krishnanagar, and when poet does it, he presents his poetical skills before the king at the court, And the king grants him a position at the court, he grants him a salary, accommodation, and pretty soon he grants him also tax-free land. So he owns a land that he doesn't have to pay taxes for. The poet probably receives the nick. So we have a poet who attends the court right now. We don't know anything more about his family as much. We don't know if he takes his father with him, what happens with his brothers. He was the youngest one. What we know that he was given a land, he lives there, and he attends the court from time to time. And as you saw at the beginning, Bharatchandra Roy is his full name. So the last part, Gunakar, is the title that was given to him by the king already when he was poet at the court. And probably he gets this title somewhere between 1748-49. He only uses this title in his last work that we think is the last work because of the usage of this title only, and the work we are going to talk about today, Annadamangal. So probably every other work he created was written before Annadamangal. His opus magnum was written. Okay, we already know that the poet started composing in his early years. On a slide, you can see all the works that came down to us, and you can find them also in critical editions. There are few. So, Satyanarayanar Bharatchandra is the first one. The young poet writes it at when he was still studying Farsi, Persian. Then we don't know which year, of course. It's not written. It's a very short work. Then we have Roshomonjori. So Roshomonjori is an adaptation of a Sanskrit work on poetics by the same title of Bhanudatta from the 15th century. And this is the only theoretical work that actually Bharatchandra wrote or composed, and it shows his interest in a very particular poetical theoretical device that is Naika Bheda, the division of heroines and heroes. And this is one of his major work, I think, although it hasn't received much attention from the scholars, because probably what I've noticed, every scholar thinks that it's just a translation of the work of Bhanudatta, but it's not. It's his own adaptation. And it's always also very important. We have this huge genre in Bengali literature that is sometimes called in histories of Bengali literature translation literature. So Ramayana, Mahabharata being the most popular one, of course, and they are treated as translations. But we know that in Bengali language, they are not merely translations. They are works of poets who put a lot of themselves into the works. They are not exact translations. They are already like very Bengali in spirit. And that's the same with Rasamanjari. It's not word-to-word translations at all. The poet picks up what he wants to translate. And that's also very important, I think, for future scholars to see what does the writer picks up from the work, what was important for him, what was the idea of the poetics during this time, because that kind of works can show us. Most probably it was composed for the court. There wouldn't be any other reason for the poet to compose to translate very theoretical work into Bengali. But it's not mentioned in the work for whom it was composed. And this is very different with the biggest work of Bharatchandra, where he mentions time after time for whom he is composing. And this particular work, Roshomonjori, is not the first adaptation of Bengali into Bengali of this work. We have many poets who translated or adapted this work. So it showed us also that Bengalis were very much interested, not as much in alankaras, but they were interested in types of heroines and heroes. Naika was the most important. And that's very interesting. So it's not like we are still, working on a very classical ideas of Sanskrit poetry that comes through every generation after generation. No, at one point, poets choose what's interesting for them in the classical theory. And it's always very interesting to me personally, what was the source of education of each poet. We tend to think about the literature, like if we talk about Bengali literature, that okay, so in 19th century we have Bharatchandra, we had other poets, so they knew each other, they corresponded, they read their works. It was not the case, of course. If you have a poet in today's south of Bangladesh, and you have a poet in today's West Bengal, most probably they never read each other if they even lived in the same time because of the difficulties of the travel. The jungles that were covering that area for so many years, and there was no ability to travel actually. And we can see that when we actually look where the manuscripts were collected. And to put it simply, usually we don't check where the manuscripts were collected. We just take the manuscript, it was created in Bengal. Everybody probably read it because we have so many, but where did they find? Did they find it around one city, around one area, or in different cities scattered all around Bengal? So for me, it's always very interesting to look who actually read the work, who knew the work. And with Bengal, it's particularly difficult sometimes because the manuscripts are usually in a very bad state or they are lost because of the weather conditions, mostly, even these days. So before we go to the third work that is listed here, the main work that we are going to talk today, Annadamangal, that we know was finished in 1752, you can see there are three works that were written in Sanskrit, like two works fully in Sanskrit, Nagashtaka and Gangashtaka, and Chandinatak, unfinished drama in Mishrito Bhasha, in the mixed language. So we have mixture of Bengali, Hindustani, and Sanskrit, but it's not a finished work. And a part of that, we have some single poems in Sanskrit, Hindustani, and Bengali that are usually at the end of the critical editions. But me personally, I've never seen the manuscript that actually shows those single poems. But the most important work that we want to talk about today is what made actually Bharatchandra famous. And when I said it made him famous, I mean he became famous because of this work 56 years after his death. So we don't know if he was famous when he wrote this work. We don't know if he was appreciated or not. The work was composed on the order, of course, of the poet's patron, King Krishnachandra Roy. And as you can imagine, we don't have any photography of Zamindari. If you actually look in the internet, you will find one photograph that everybody writes Krishnachandra Roy. That it's impossible because photography was invented in the 19th century, not in the 18th. So it's not possible that's him. But here I want you to see the Zamindari of Krishnachandra was one of the most important in Bengal. It was not the richest. We know that he had huge debts, but he was a great patron of art. He was a great patron of Shaivas, a great patron of Nyaya, Nava Nyaya particularly. And so he was famous, and he was famous among foreigners who were at that time in Bengal. And he knew, he was quite a modern king, and he knew that cooperation with foreigners can be good. But what I wanted to show you, so you can imagine that his court was one of the most important of that time, okay? And this is the remains after 200 years only, yeah? This is the main gate of his palace, and this is the second, actually the main entrance of the palace. There are no photographies, nobody can enter the palace anymore. Some movies on internet, especially done by Bengalis who travel there, and they just give some strange photos of colonial furniture being inside the palace, some destroyed buildings. We have no idea how the palace looks right now, but this is the main gate of the palace. Nobat Khana, and then we have the main gate. Let's go back here, or maybe here. So this is the manuscript that I found, and the oldest that I found. It was written in the 1783, so not many years after the poet's death. And it was brought to Paris soon after creation of the manuscript, and it's preserved in a very good condition. It's one of the best preserved manuscripts. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris, and it is only the second part of the work, the romantic part, that was the most popular also later on, and I will tell you that soon. It's not very beautifully written, it's nicely written, not bad. The scribe changes, I think, in one point, or he changes his style of writing a little bit. It's sometimes not very recognizable, but still for Bengali manuscript, it's a very nice manuscript, and we are happy to have that one. So coming back, this song, Annadamangal, we can translate it as a song in praise of Annada, Annada being the name of the goddess. The giver of the goddess abundant in food or rice, la diosa abundante en comida, arroz, as we can translate in Spanish. Annada or Annapurna, two names appear in the text. So, of course, one of the many manifestations of Parvati. And the poet himself calls the work Mongol, Mongola, Mongol Kabbo, as it's called later. And this is a very important and very vast genre in the pre-modern Bengali literature, Mongol Kabbo. The oldest examples date from the 15th century, and they are usually dedicated to one particular god or goddess. Usually it's the goddess who is the main character. These texts usually consist of two parts. One section called Devakhanda, divine section, Debkondo, and it tells about the origin of the deity, her relationships with other gods, and the second part called Norokondo, Narakanda, so human section, that relates the spread of deities' worship among humans. There are usually some protagonists. Each Mongol Kabbo, each work has different protagonists, depends on the god or goddess it's about. So Bharatchandra composed this poem of benediction, as we can call it, finished it in 1752, 8 years before his death. He dies in 1760. It's a different Mongol Kabbo, and Bharatchandra knows it. It was not created for ritual, as usually. At least we don't have any evidence that would suggest otherwise. It was not performed during religious ceremonies, sung by village communities on particular days of the worship. It's a courtly work intended for an eye and ear of an experienced listener or reader. Roshik, Rasika. Yes, so it's a completely different, so it's like a folk Mongol Kabbo that usually deals with folk deities that want to enter the main pantheon of Hinduism mostly, but it's done in such a pompous way that it's actually only for the court. It's not only more very simple poem of benediction. It's already more elevated. And the listener has to be experienced. That's important, and Bharatchandra is very conscious about that. Okay. For various reasons that we don't have time to explain now, scholars consider this work as a trilogy of 3 different texts, each of different length. So the first one is Shibayon, or so-called proper Annadamangal, proper poem of benediction. Second one is called Kolika Mongol, or Vidyasundar, Vidyasundara. And the third one is Manshingho. Manshingho has a name of a person here. The first part Shibayon or Annadamangal would be the divine section in the genre. And the second and third section, Kalika-Mongol and Manshinho, would be the human sections in the traditional division. And it's usually the second section that you can see here. Kalika-Mongol, usually more popularly known as Bidda Shundor part, is actually that gets the most attention and used to get the most attention. We can see how many manuscripts we have of this part and how many publications in the next century appeared of this section. So that was the most popular. And to tell you shortly what's the story of the whole work. So the first part, Shibayon, is based on Puranic stories. It consists of various invocations to gods and goddesses, the story of Daksha's sacrifice, Shiva's marriage to Parvati, confrontation of the goddess with Vyasa in Benares, and at the very end, there is a story about Kubera's son who doesn't worship Annapurna Parvati, and she sent him to the earth and with his wives, and he became on the earth the ancestors of the poet's patron, Bhavananda Mojumdar. So we have the connection with the divine word and human word when somebody by the curse of the god has to be on the earth, and these appear to be the forefathers of the patrons of our poet. And so the poet claims in his work that Onnoda, the goddess, chooses the patron's forefather as his representative on the earth. The second part, the most beautiful, I think, and everybody does as well, of this opus magnum, the tale of Vidya and Sundar. So we have two names, female Vidya and Sundar, male, boy and girl, is based on the literary tradition associated with goddess Kali in Bengal. The theme of this romantic tale of those two lovers, Vidya and Sundar, is not new in the Bengali literature. The oldest we have, probably, not everybody agrees, comes from the 14th century, and it was written by a Muslim writer, Shah Barid Khan. Then we have one work from the 16th century by Dvija Sridhar. Then we have two from the 17th century, Gobindo Das from Chittagong, so probably nobody read it in the West Bengal because it was too far away, and Krishna Ram Das. And two more in the 18th century, very close to the period that Bharatchandra actually created, Bolaram Chakraborty Kobishekhar and Ram Prasad Sen, very important Shakta poet. So what's the plot of this most popular, most beautiful part of the work? It's a romantic story of the princess, Vidya, Bidda, and Prince Sundar. The princess has sworn to marry only the one who defeats her in a scientific debate. So Sundar, the prince who arrived from a different country, other kingdom, with the help of goddess Kali, to whom he prays all the time, in disguise of a student, digs a tunnel to the castle, to the princess' chamber directly, with the help of goddess, yes? So it's not that he dug it by himself so much. And they meet, they fall in love, and there are many vivid descriptions of lovers making love in this part. There is an element of scandal, of course, at the end, because Vidya becomes pregnant. The king, her father, becomes furious, and he orders to find the secret lover. The lover is called Chor in the work, the thief. And Sundar is addressed like that in the whole work. After many difficulties, they are trying to find Sundar. Finally, they captured him. He, in defense of himself in front of the king, recites some examples of Sanskrit poetry. So we have parts, usually in most manuscripts, the most manuscripts, the oldest one have only 3 or 5 shlokas from Chaura Panchashika by Bilhana. But there are some in the 19th century that produce the whole work of Bilhana inside. They put the whole work. So this part also had its different life also. It was changed in the 19th century, depending who actually printed it. So he recites the Sanskrit poetry in front of the king. He is not pleased with this, and still the prince is sentenced to death. He is, of course, saved by Goddess Kali, and also at the same time, royal messenger appears who confirms Sundar's identity. He tells the king that he's not a normal person, he's not a chor, he's a prince from the other country, and he should not be ashamed that he will marry his daughter. Actually, they are married by Gandharva, by Gandharva marriage. So, the king accepts his son-in-law and pays homage to Kali. After 10 months, Vidya gives a birth to a son. In Bengali literature, Middle Bengali literature, and not only, also later, pregnancy lasts 10 months. She gives a birth to a son, and Sundar at that time wants to return to his parents' place, to his country, to Kanchi at the south. Vidya resists. We have this beautiful example of her lament, Baromashi. So she laments in every month of the year. Beautiful presentation of this one particular piece of poetry. But eventually they leave the country disguised as ascetics and travel to Kanchi. From Kanchi, Kali takes them to Kailasa. They don't live anymore on the earth so much, and their son becomes the king of the Kanchi. And that's the most popular. It's the most popular because it's written in a very beautiful and ornamental language. It's a romantic story, and who doesn't like romantic story? Yes, 19th century, 20th century. But it also has a very expressive erotic poetry. That created so many problems in the 19th century for Bharatchandra because he was accused of using too vulgar language. He was called by doyens of Bengali literature as a vulgar author. But I'm going to talk today about the third part, not the second one, Monshing. This part is different from all the other human sections in Mongol Kabbos, as it narrates the story of actually person who existed, historic person, the forefather of patrons, of poet's patron, the story of the founding of the dynasty of Rajas of Nadia. So, shortly speaking, Annapurna, the goddess, sends a flood to the Mughal army, and Bhavananda Majumdar, the forefather of the poet, helps the Mughal army, and which is why Mansingho Rajput, who was the ruler, that in Bengali we would call him Subadar or Shubedar or Nawab of Bengal of that time. So, trying to be thankful, he decides to take the forefather of the poet to Delhi to present him to the emperor as a recognition for what he did to the army. So we have this amazing part when we have discussion between Emperor Jahangir with Bhavananda Majumdar, a theological debate actually about Islam and Hinduism, after which offended emperor throws the forefather of the patron of the poet into the prison. Annapurna, of course, helps his devotee, Bhavananda, and by her will, all the food from Delhi disappears. There is no food to be found, so everybody starves. She reveals herself to the Emperor Jahangir, and after this vision and the starvation, Emperor releases Bhavananda, gives him the royal title, so now he can use the title Raja, and Bhavananda returns to his homeland as a Raja and organizes a huge feast for Annapurna. That's usually a very important part in Bengali Mangal Kabbos, where food is presented on many pages, very difficult to translate, very difficult to understand because food was so much different, and we have page after page about the description of food that was presented to the god or the feast that was presented. Very interesting part of Mangal Kabba. As I told you, we don't know, so this is shortly speaking the idea, the story of the whole work, very shortly speaking, of course. We don't know about the reception of the work. Everybody, of course, will claim that he was famous, the work was amazing, but we actually have no proof how it spread, how many manuscripts were produced, who was able to listen to it. The king himself awarded the poet with the title Gunakar, that means well of virtues, before creating this work, because it already appears in the Kabbo, in Annadamangal. In every part, he uses this title. We know that around 20-30 years after the death of Bharatchandra, his work traveled to Kolkata. And Kolkata, and within Kolkata and the neighbor cities, for the next 100 years, it quite shook the literary world. Kolkata in the 19th century was not only intellectual, economic, political center, but also became a kind of barometer of literary tastes and the center of disputes among literary critics and artists. And this work, particular work, was for many years the center of the discussion. As I told you already, it was the huge scandal in the second half of the 19th century. It was accused and it was banned from publishing, even though before, for 50 years, it was published and read by many. So it's very interesting how it had another life, lived another life in Kolkata. It's important that I mention here that this is the first Bengali work published into print in 1816. Some parts of the play of this work were the parts that were staged in Bengali theater already in 1795. So songs, I'm talking about songs from the work, were taken and put into another composition. So this is interesting. It's so much involved in the modern Bengali literature. Not only the first book, Bengali book published, but also his songs were put into the first Bengali drama that was staged. The first I have chosen to show you, this is not from the first one, unfortunately, but these are from the beginning of the 19th century, some lithographs from the work, beautiful lithographs of the poem. Here you can see, this is the publication from 1823 by hand, as you can see. So maybe we'll stay with two main protagonists, Vidya and Sundar, over here. And not only it was the first book, but the examples, the text itself, appeared in the second Bengali grammar that appeared. Sometimes it's called the first Bengali grammar, written by Nathaniel Halhed, that was published in 1778, but there is another Bengali grammar that sometimes is forgotten, written by a monk in 1746, Portuguese monk. But that time it was forgotten, so Nathaniel Halhed grammar was considered to be the first one, but it's not. We had 30 years before we had the first one. Between 1816, the publication, and 1858, at least 9 editions were printed in Kolkata, and 10 separate editions of the second part, the romantic part, were also published. The most important edition was published in 1847. It was prepared by Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar, very eminent Sanskrit scholar, teacher at Sanskrit College and social reformer. This edition is considered to be the first scholarly edition of this work and is based on alleged manuscript from the library of the Krishnanagar court, so from the main source. But nobody ever saw this manuscript anymore. We have no idea from which manuscript it was taken, but Vidyasagar claims that it was taken from the library of the Raja itself, so probably the one that was actually created during the times of Bharatchandra. This work was published in 2 volumes in 1847. The entire work contains a title of each pada as a narrative part, which is still used today. So what they did, as you saw on the manuscript before, it's a very typical way of writing Bengali. Yeah, there are some divisions here, but and over here, as far as I remember, there are no musical notations in this work, but the scribe writes the meter before each pada. So if you know the meter, you know already how to recite it because you recite it aloud. Yes, so that was very important to know, not to check, not to count, and these things disappeared after some time. So we have no musical instructions, we have no introduction to the meter at the beginning of pada. So it shows how work was already read different. It was read. We didn't need meters, we didn't need musical notations anymore. And that's what I always try to remember, yeah, that, I read it this way, so maybe what I did actually, I read it aloud to myself. Even not in a way, of course, they did that times because we have no idea how they did, but it sounds different also. You can see those differences. None of the volume that was published has any introduction of fire word, and that is very strange for Bengali books. And the second edition was prepared almost 100 years later, in 1943, and that's why that one is also in use these days. As I told you, most print editions do not inform about the modes of melodics, rhythmic model of the individual parts of the work. They never provide any meter at the beginning of the padas, and they don't indicate which part is the refrain, because these works, they had refrain, they were sung, there was always a refrain. If you read it, you don't see it. But if you read the first manuscript, you can see it's written Dhruvapad, Dhruvapada, that's the refrain. So repeated part of this work, sometimes very important because it can change the meaning of what you read. So we have those modern changes in the work as it was printed. It was not used anymore in the manuscript. I will skip a few things to tell you more about. Okay, so here you can see one edition from the 19th century, and you can see that it shows that there is Dhuya, it's Dhruvapada in Bengali also, and Poyar, so the meter, and this actually shows still the idea of printing the way it was printed in the manuscript. It was written in the manuscript, sorry, because later on we will have a beautiful song, written line after line, like a modern poetry. But this was more the manuscript style. So that's also very interesting to see how the print changed slowly. First printing, out as the way manuscript was read, and later on only, all the divisions, chapters, everything separated. So in the last section that I told you about, in Manshing section, we can find very interesting passages in which poet uses technical terminology of poetics. And so we have this story that the king comes back from Delhi. Yes, you remember. He comes back from Delhi from the meeting with Jahangir. He is released. So the court welcomes him joyfully. The poet tells what kind of actions, what he did, what the king did after arriving, one by one. So first he bows to the statue of Govinda, he greets his mother and father, gathered women of the court make auspicious sounds, and the Mughal, the ruler is greeted by everybody. But then the ruler wonders he has two wives. He wonders which of two wives he should visit first. They are not at the main gathering. Each one will be offended if he doesn't come directly to them. Yes? Unable to decide, he goes to his mother's chamber to tell her about the journey, what he suffered, and then his friends come, he meets with his friends, and in the evening, so he's already there for a few hours, yes, he still hasn't visited his wives. He changed his formal robes, so in Bengali it's called dorberir kapor, so the clothes he uses to show himself to other people outside, changed into dhuti, so we have this very common Bengali thing, wearing dhuti at home, and he took betel for relaxing. And at this point, both maids of the queen, so we have maids, they are called dashi in the text, dasi, so servants, slaves, they are the intermediaries between king and queens. Shodhi and Modhi. Shodhi is the maid of the older queen, and she tells her mistress how they should persuade the king to visit her first. So the servants have one work to do. They have to persuade the king to come not to the older queen, but to the younger, and the second to the older. So they will fight a little bit. So the oldest queen, we have the maid of the oldest queen. She told her that she's the main queen. The king became Raja already by Mughal order. So she is the main queen. She is the most important. He should visit her. For sure, they know that the youngest queen is planning something with her servant, because there is this many funny things happen here. Older queen thinks that the servant of the youngest queen knows some chants, mantras, other spells. Probably they will do something to them or to the king, so they have to do something. So we have those two conversations between servants and queens. I will skip a little bit. We have the quarrel of two servants in front of the Raja. They try to convince him. So the oldest queen, she's older, she has sons with him, so she's more important. But the king still doesn't know what to do. So what king does, he actually tells them, two maids, go away, leave me alone. I will eat betel by myself. As you know, betel has double meaning in the poetry, yes? It's a kind of introduction to sexual intercourse, to frolics. So he said, because they ask him, take betel from my queen, yeah, come and eat betel with her. So he says, I'm going to eat betel by myself. It doesn't end like that, don't worry. So his mother, king's mother, saves him a little bit. She tells him to go to his chambers, eat betel there. King does as his mother commands him to, but he sees the eldest queen standing next to the door because he has to pass his door. So they change, of course, cordialities. The queen invites him to the chamber to visit her and her sons. She uses this, come and visit me and my sons, your sons. But king doesn't want to decide yet. He is wondering what to do. He wants actually to go to the younger queen. He expressed that in his mind. But the older one blocks the way. Of course, again, maids appear, they argue, and how does it end? It's a very difficult thing to explain in English, but the poet uses very nice way. So he uses the double meaning of queens' names. So Chandramukhi is the oldest queen. Padmamukhi, Poddomukhi in Bengali, it's the youngest. So we have moon, the one who is beautiful as a moon, who has face a moon, and the one who has a face as a lotus. So we have moon, and you know the relation about lotus and the moon. The lotus, this is the lotus that opens when the moon shines. So we have this beautiful exchange of words that the king says to the queens, and they are both satisfied. They don't quarrel anymore. When he says that without the moon, lotus doesn't open. So without you, you are nothing. You coexist together. You are perfect living together. It's a very beautiful way it's written in Bengali, with just the play, with the names. So what happens? Both queens are satisfied. King has to go to the chambers of the older one. After spending a passionate life with the older queen, he wants to go to visit the younger one and spend also night with her. But he is full of doubts. And this is a very funny thing in the poem, that we have the passion play that just happened. It's not described anymore. And the poet says directly that it was already described in the work. So he means it was described in the second part, when two lovers, Vidya and Sundar, were making love passionately. So in the third part, he doesn't describe how the king actually, that we know by name, the forefather of the poet's patron, makes love. It's just mentioned that it was already told somewhere else. He wants to go to the second queen, but he's full of doubts. And what he does here is very interesting for me, and I wanted to share you that with you here today, because he starts quoting theoretical works. He starts using words that are usually not used in Bengali poetry. They are used in theoretical works on poetry, but not in the text itself. It's not very common to see these words. You can sometimes see nayak, naika as a word of the hero, heroine in the text. And that also have many connotations if it appears. But here we have an example, and it happened twice in this text, that he specifies the types of heroines. So he actually quotes Ashta Naika Bheda, Oshto Naiko Bhed, in Bengali, 8 types of heroines, using not the description of the woman that it's usually done, but uses the terms. So in order to understand the terms, what he's talking about, you have to know them. And this is that's why it became very interesting to me. So this is the part that I've chosen for you, one of two. So happy with confessed love, Padmamukhi returns to her chambers, and the king went to Chandramukhi's chambers, embraced her, took possession of her heart, playing with her. As soon as the child fell asleep, the king began to play with the queen until half of the night had passed. He suddenly desired to go to his younger wife, so he abandoned the room of the elder one. He thought while walking, both my wives, Proshitas Bhartrikas, were suffering. And when I write here the translation were suffering, it doesn't exist in the original. It's only both my wife, Proshito Bhartrikas. As soon as they saw me, they became Voshoshodjo. All those chambers, whose chambers shall I visit first? Both wives are Utkonthita. And you see, it's very difficult even not to pronounce what does it mean, because there is no sense if you don't know the meanings of those words. So, Boshoshadjo prepared to receive me, the one who put the dress on. Whose chamber shall I visit first? Both wives are eager for love. They were already ready to go to a rendezvous at the door. I didn't go to either of them. I stood, uncertain, thoughtful. Both became vipralabdho, abandoned in love. Now that I have spent the night with my elder wife, I wonder what Padmamukhi thinks of me. One is Svadhina Bhartrika, so the older one who just spent the night, satisfied with her husband. The other is Proshito Bhartrika, longing for her lover. I'm the matchless lover, hero. I'm the hero of the great drama. I will go to her, press her tightly to my heart, and make her Svadhina Bhartrika. I cannot kill, crush her hopes as such a beautiful wife. If I were to leave her chamber at the end of the night, she would not speak to me again. Poddomukhi would become Kondita, betrayed. She will show this by speaking bitter words. She will become Kalahantarita, separated by a quarrel, and will lament in great sorrow. Driven away by her, I will go back here to Chandramukhi, who will again become Kondita, jealous. She will drive me away by her younger wife. She will show her anger. Both will become Kalahantarita, separated by anger. Thus will the night pass for me. I will drown in the estimation of lust. No one will come to my aid. If I go to her now, I will reach two shores. The pleasure of both my wives is equal. Okay, it sounds complicated, yes, especially with those terms. But what I wanted to show you here is not only it's a very rare example that poet uses, especially in the place in the work that is so important and funny because we have those quarrels with servants and lovemaking. He suddenly actually puts those terms only, not describing what they mean. So as I told you, Bharatchandra translates one work that actually speaks about types of heroines and heroes, and we know there are many other translations. So this was popular poetic device in Bengal that poets loved. And it's very important to mention here that Bengali writers did not develop any work on the theory of poetry of Middle Bengali, the way it was written, for example, in the Riti poetry in the West, in Hindustani, for example. We know there is one work, 15th century work, written by theorist Shubhankara, that was written in Sanskrit, Sangita Damodara, that was for many years translated orally. It was very well distributed. We know that first Indologists heard about this work. They couldn't find it for a very long time, and I'm talking about big names like William Jones and others. Finally, they found two manuscripts that were published in 1958, and then later on they found another manuscript, and now we know what kind of information were given on the drama or dance on poetry within this work that was circulated so abundantly on the territory of Bengal. But my question here is why Bharatchandra includes actually very theoretical vocabulary in his work, not once but twice. He does something completely different than other authors who usually give a mental and physical description of the heroine, and Bharatchandra mentions only the theory. He doesn't describe how they look, what they suffered, what they did. He just gives the basic names. Kalahantarita, Kandita, Proshita Bhartika. That's all. My proposal here is how to understand this idea of the poet is that there are two ways for me. The poet innovates poetics somehow by referring just to technical terms. At the same time, he refers to the technical works on poetry. Maybe he refers to his own work, his translation of Rasamanjari by Bhanudatta, that he wrote probably a few years before the Annadamangal. But there is also another option that I'm very eager to take, but I'm not sure if I can. So the poet actually wants to educate his listeners. Not only to educate, but when you read this work, you cannot get rid of this idea behind in your head that the poet is looking at the court and comments it in a very ironical way. And I think here twice he uses this device maybe to ridicule somebody personally, because we can imagine that the work is performed in front of the Raja and there are other dignitaries. Some are more intelligent, some are less. We know from one poem that I already showed you, but I didn't tell you what was that about. And so Nagashtaka It's, for example, Sanskrit poem, short poem, in which he ridicules one of his enemies, whose part of the name was Naga. So it has double meaning. So why wouldn't he do that in Bengali work that was so important and popular? Maybe he wanted to, maybe the knowledge of theory of poetry was not so good as we think at the court of Krishna Chandra. I wouldn't dare to write it in my book, but who knows? Because that's very tempting to see why he does the reverse what usually poets do. He doesn't describe how they look, what they suffered, what they fought. He just gives the names. So maybe he wants listeners to remember these are the types of naikas. Remember that. And it's easier to remember, actually. Probably theatrical works were not sung and performed in front of the audience. They were read. And it's easier when you actually have it in performance, you know, in such an important parts. And it's they usually naturally actually appears when the actual love takes place, because it tells us about love. Those heroines, yes, are usually at one stage of love or the other. So this is what interested me, not only this, of course, but I chosen to tell you about this part only to show you how different approach had the poet, and why he did why did he write the terms only of poetics in the work, not describe everything. It's I think I have never read anybody writing about that, and that made me interested in this idea of the poet. Why did he do that? Was he actually, I like to think that he was educating somebody, and maybe that's as we know, listening to the literary work was also a part of education, yes, memorizing it, so maybe that was also the part of education. We don't know if Bharatchandra was teaching somebody at the court. Probably he did, because that's what usually poets did at the courts. They were the teachers of the princess. So maybe that was also created by poet and put into the work to educate somebody at the court, also a part of the main performance of the whole work. So I think I spoke too long, and I think if you have any other questions, I will try to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panashuk, for guiding us through the different layers of this literary work. So, of course, we have time to open the microphone to commentaries and questions. If someone in the audience wants to participate.
Hello, thank you for a very engaging presentation and topic. I'm quite unfamiliar with these materials, as many others. Of course, it's just impossible to cover everything about India, but like I'm trying to think of this work in particular, like as how it can respond to a wider context. Now, of course, this belongs to the late Mughal period, regardless of whether the specific territory was under direct Mughal administration. No, but that's beyond the point because of the impact of Mughal culture. And I find striking comparisons with other works in other parts of India in at least two or three different fronts. So, like, on the one hand, there seems to be a very particular tendency in courtly literature, Mughal or otherwise, in which there is a strong there is a constant reference to poetics, to Sanskrit poetics. This happens in India, in North India, in Hindi works under Mughal courts, or even in South in Telugu works that deal both with Sanskrit poetics or with aesthetics of Telugu language, but using or borrowing Sanskrit terminology. So this is like sort of similar. So I'm actually wondering about your own proposal, whether he's ridiculing anybody. Maybe he's just responding to the expectations of the court, no? That is what probably aristocracy is basically waiting for in a courtly poet, no? Probably, no? So that's on the one hand. Then on the other one, I can't remember if it was in this third section of the Annadamangal or in the second one, in which the hero at least partly becomes an ascetic.
No, when he becomes ascetic, that was the story from his biography.
Yeah, nobody in the text, right?
No,
Oh, yeah.
it doesn't appear in the text.
Because it made me think of Sufi romances.
Uh-huh.
It happens all the time.
No. The poet doesn't give us a lot about the text. It's usually very funny to read stories of Bengali literature, especially in Bengali, when they write, we have so many information about the poet, but we actually don't, and that's why I made this longer introduction. But no, the poet just gives in Bhanitas, in the last two verses of some padas, he just gives the names and the name of his father, the name of his village, and that's all. He never wrote that he was ascetic. So we get this information from just Ishwar Chandra Gupta 100 years later. But referring to your first question, maybe I will respond. Yes, of course, I think there is a possibility that he actually inclines and does what the court expects him to do. We know there was another poet, right? Everybody claims that Ramprasad Sen, who also wrote a Vidyasundar story, probably between 10 years within the same time. We still don't know who was the first. Probably because they lived in the very same area, probably they knew the text, whichever was the first. It's completely different. It's amazing to see two texts on the same topic written in a completely different way in the same actual environment. And many scholars, especially first scholars, claim that it was also the Ramprasad Sen also wrote that for the court of Nadia, but we don't have any proof for that. And he never mentions the king. There are many misconceptions about Raj of Nadia, the kingdom of Nadia. There are many examples of characters who appear later on and who are linked to the court, but we have absolutely no proof that they ever existed. So it's very difficult to say what's fake, what's not fake here. Even given by a very good scholar, in the middle of 19th century. But I think you are right. Of course, I think it's very open for discussion. I find it unusual. That's why I mentioned that. But we have to also remember, as you know, we cannot know everything. And with Bengali literature is very particular. The state, no, not the state, but the research that was done on Bengali literature, especially Middle Bengali literature, was mostly done on works written by Hindu writers. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts of works by Muslim writers that were never read nor published. If you go to Dhaka, if you go to Kolkata, if you go to any manuscript library, you will have them, in many numbers. Sometimes you are not able to actually open even it because they are glued already, so you have no idea what kind of work is inside. But there are really hundreds of works that were never read. So our vision of, the literature is so limited only to those who were important at one particular time for Bengali Hindu reformers in the 19th century who recreated this history of Bengali literature. Getting rid of the old Farsi words, getting rid of, purifying the language. I don't want to make a mistake, but I remember one scholar wrote that at the beginning of the 19th century, the amount of Sanskrit vocabulary in Bengali was 30% at the beginning of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, it was 75%. Yeah. So the language was so much purified, according to Bengalis, Sanskritized, that's why it's very difficult for modern Bengalis to read Middle Bengali literature, because it's full of vocabulary from Farsi, especially if you read Muslim writers. And we know we have many manuscripts of many works that we can see they were extremely popular, because you can find more than 10 or 20.
And in this regard, do we know if Bharatchandra wrote any works in Persian?
No, we don't have this. Everybody claims that he knew Persian because he was studying Persian. We can see the usage of Farsi vocabulary, but I think we always have to remember that the language that people spoke that time was probably much mixed with Farsi, the Bengali itself, the spoken language. And also it's very interesting, you know, because I didn't say that, but this work, Annadamangal, is usually claimed to be not very religious, as it used to be before. I mean, all the mangalas were dedicated to gods, goddesses, you know, took part in worship. It was to praise the patron, the family of the patron, the Nodia Raj family. So why was it not written in Sanskrit, for example, if Nodia at that time was a huge, big center of Sanskrit scholars, extremely important? Why Annadamangal was the work that was firstly published, a part of the vicinity of Kolkata? All the scholars that were invited by first Indologists coming from the West, they were from the center of Sanskrit studies, from Krishnanagar, from the Nodia. They were from the environment of Raja Krishnachandra. They were the one who gave information about Hindu customs, Sanskrit works. They found the Sanskrit word. They shared the knowledge. They were all from the kingdom of Nodia, most of them. So that's why they claimed that Raja Krishnachandra was the best. He was very famous within French, English. That's why Annadamangal was very famous in Kolkata also at the very beginning of the 19th century, and later on taking completely new life, being published many times. So this is very also interesting. But we have no example of him writing in Farsi. We have more because the problem is that Bengali researchers, me myself, we don't read so much Farsi manuscripts written in Arabic alphabet or changed Arabic alphabet. We know about some poets whose manuscripts are written both in Bengali and Arabic. They are still Bengali, so it's Bengali written in Arabic script. We have them a lot, especially from today's parts of Bangladesh, but not here. The claim about Farsi is always looking at the vocabulary the poet uses. If it's not too Sanskritized, usually he's not called the best one. If it's too Persianized, it's more Muslim literature, not Bengali literature. We can find that kind of examples in books, in works, scholarly works. So there is another division called Musalmani Sahitya within the Bengali Sahitya. So they are put apart, and we know that they actually engage together. We have more and more examples of that. We can see references. Welcome.
Yeah, I want to ask two questions. The first one, you mentioned, you talk about the importance of reception and oral performance. Who were the people receiving these texts in general, and the centrality of oral performance? Maybe can you elaborate a little bit about the context in which it was performed? Because as you already said, we do not know much, because we only have these two sources for reconstructing the context and the life of this poet. But I am so very interested in the afterlife of the work. You already mentioned how some portions of the text were used in this play. I don't remember the name, but I am wondering if there were other fragments of the work, that were performed independently in other, perhaps more popular contexts.
Of course. So answering to your first question, we have actually a lot of information about not even the performance, but who are the listeners. Because in the part of his work, he mentions the chord. We have a vivid description of the chord. We have the name of the singer who was the first one to perform. So this is interesting, Gayen in Bengali. We have the name of the Gayen. So probably poet was sitting next to the Gayen. Gayen was performing. We don't know that if, of course, they were sitting next to each other. But we have the whole family, the closest family of the king. And we have, of course, dignitaries who are named over there. So looking at the work and the way it's written, it's a difficult work to read comparing to other Mongol kabbas. In other Mongol kabbas, Mangal kavyas, if we pronounce it in more Sanskrit classical way, the language is usually very dialectical. It's not very Sanskritized. Here, Bharatchandra Sanskritizes a language a lot. It's a very sophisticated language, but also he puts lots of Farsi words. So it's not pure Sanskrit here. One of the biggest doyens of Bengali literature, Shukumar Sen, he claimed that his characters, they don't have soul. It's a very artificial poetry. He appreciated that, but he compared it with the other, especially Mukundaram Chakraborty's Chandi Mongol. That's very famous and written 100 years before Bharatchandra composed his one. One can see that you need a lot of sophistication to understand Bharatchandra. And at the musicality of the poem is amazing because he doesn't care about alankaras as much. We have this instance of naikas, those descriptions, of course. We have typical comparisons, upamas, the most popular one. So you don't think about alankaras so much, but what he perfects in is his uses of vocabulary and alliteration. The lines, the whole, sometimes padas, is full of alliteration. And it sounds amazing when you read it aloud. It can be boring when you read it in a silence. It seems very theoretical, but in performance, it must have produced much more effect than normal work. And what's important here to say, he does a lot of innovation. He takes 3 or 4 meters from the Sanskrit theory and composes in those meters in Bengali for the first time. It was never done by any other poet, so there was not huge influence on, changing the meters in Bengali poetry, but for sure it must have done a huge impact on the listeners. Bengalis are very musical till these days. So for them, for sure, it was important to see that, okay, meter changed here. Yes, before we had only 2 meters used in Mangal Kabbos, Poyar and Tripodi. So just 2, and he introduced few more. So the works already is completely different. You read it differently. And the different life of the work. So a part of the editions that I told you about, a part of the examples like taking out the songs, putting into the drama, there was, 19th century was a time when jatra, very popular form of theater, hailing from the folk theater, came to Kolkata, and not only, they were groups performing dramas based on different works. And there was Vidya Sundar, the second part, was one of the most popular theme for those jatras, and because of Bharatchandra, not the other one that I mentioned that are usually not read. Even if I mentioned Ramprasad Sen, that was living the same time, who is considered to be a saint these days, also in those times, because of his poems to Kali. Most of the people probably would not know that he wrote a very erotic, long text about Vidya and Sundar. And you have only one edition of this work without introduction that you can find. And what Annadamangal did, here you have in the middle, you have the first page of the Bengali grammar that's considered to be the first one. but as you know already, it's the second. Then you have the advertisement of the Disguise or the Indian Serenade, the first drama which was performed in Bengali. It was not written in Bengali, it was translated into Bengali. And then we had songs from Annadamangal. And in the first Bengali grammar, of course, we have examples from the work to show the grammatical use of some words or just the grammatical use. And he gives example from Annadamangal. Later on, in Kolkata, especially in the middle of the century, 19th century, we have these Bot Tola editions, cheap book editions. Books were very expensive. The first Annadamangal that was published cost 4 rupees, and we know 4 rupees was a very big amount of money. First Bengali book, we can imagine only rich people could afford the printed book. Later on, in the middle of the century, Bot Tola editions, so North Kolkata editions, leaflets, 15 pages, 20 excerpts of different works. Vidya Sundar's Love-Making especially was one of the most popular printed text in Bot Tola editions. It would be extremely interesting, of course, to compare, because we already know what kind of changes were made to some of them. So, for example, Sanskrit verses. In some publications, we have whole Chaura Panchashika by Bilhana printed inside the text, not 3 or 5 verses that we find in original. So it evolved. So it was inspiration for theater, it was inspiration for drama, for poetry also, of course. Later on, we have this huge scandal in the second part of the 19th century where actually some writers want to ban publications. We already have 50, 60 years of publication of this work in print. And suddenly, Bengalis decide it's too offensive. We have this huge change of aesthetics, because he is, for the first time, he is called too erotic, too vulgar. This description of lovemaking, they are very different than in other parts of Bengali poetry. They are very descriptive, and they are usually describing as biporitoroti, so reverse. So the woman is the active part, not the passive one. So very interesting things happen, especially also when it's printed out and it spreads around, but it was one of the most popular books in the 19th century, and later on forgotten. We don't know why, but as most of the Middle Bengali works at the beginning of the 20th century, there is a less and less interest in reading the Bengali literature that was already, the history of Bengali literature that was created in the 19th century. It's already quite stable. We have already big names in literature, historians of Bengali literature, be it Bengali language. They don't feel need to do more research. They already have their heroes. Later on, we have another Rabindranath and other big names. So it changes here, it stops here. Nobody does research on Sylheti literature, Muslim literature written in different alphabet, because nobody reads this alphabet. I mean, there are people who do, but scholars don't so much. We still have it left. So we have one more thing to discover, Bengali literature written in different alphabets. Okay, if somebody of you reads Arabic script, knows Bengali, would be perfect for research. Yes, let's go and find some manuscripts and read them. What's there? We don't know. We just claim after, 100, 200 years, the same idea of how the literature looked like, how it spread, how it evolved, leaving behind all the things that we didn't look at. But this is not the case, of course, with this work. But this is not read, as you can imagine, very widely read literature. It was translated, the only part that was translated into English was the second part. Till 2018, it was Vidya Sundara part in the States. And only in 2018, French professor, Bengalese, translated the whole work in a bilingual edition of Murti classical edition, Franz Bhattacharya. So this is the first full translation of the work, a very amazing translation, very difficult work to do, especially with alliteration, all those double meanings that, as you know, Sanskrit scholars know it's so untranslatable into any other language. But Yeah, it had huge impact in the 19th century. Later on, it was more or less forgotten. But still, I know there are some palas, like village performances in some parts. I've heard in Bangladesh, called Vidya and Sundar. Probably there is the source of the inspiration was this work. But who knows, maybe it was the other work of Muslim authors that also wrote in the 15th, 16th century. The work and the tradition was still there in the region of the lovers.
We have still time for another question. Yes.
I have two questions. First, you mentioned that his, I think his pen name was Gunakar. Is that from Gunakar, like the sinner, or is it totally different?
No.
It's the name of
Guna
the
is a virtue.
Huh?
Virtue.
It's a virtue.
It's a virtue. He was a well of virtue, full of virtues.
Okay. So it's not Gunakar.
No. He was not
Gunakar.
the sinner. That would be interesting to have that kind of title, but no.
Okay, so he was the doer of good deeds or virtues. Okay.
Yes.
The second question is about, so you mentioned that the Bengali literature of this period, it combined Hindustani, Persian, and Bengali words in terms of the vocabulary, right?
Yes.
So it's interesting because in terms of genre, like in the ghazal, love is always unrequited. So there's no question of love making or descriptions of it because it's never returned. So here, like in terms of genre, is there an influence of Hindu mythology and where there is, actual union? And it would be interesting to study the Muslim writers because they're working in a genre where there's actually love making, but because in the ghazal, it doesn't exist. It's like an absent. So how would you describe the influence in terms of genre? Yeah, on this particular.
Well, thank you for this question. The influence of, first of all, Hindu mythology, but also Hindu erotic concepts, it's very strong in Bengali literature. As I told you, we don't have till now translations of works that were created by Muslim writers as much. There are not many also scholars who deal with that kind of literature. We have some Bengali version of Laila Majnu, of course, but I haven't read them, so I don't know how they describe lovemaking. Here, we have to remember, that's what I said, it's important to know where the work was created and for whom. So Raja Krishna Chandra was very much goddess-oriented king. And he wanted, actually, he established two of the most important, as it's claimed that he established two of the most important festivals, Durga Puja and Jagadhatri Puja in Bengal. He supported, Shakta cults all over his kingdom, and we know he was in favor. It's very interesting to see what Bharatchandra does in his work because you can feel that he tries to be politically correct at one point. What he does in the work, technically, looking at the way he writes, sometimes he starts the pala with a short poem. And usually those poems are very beautiful poems, more beautiful the narration that goes after. And they're usually on the Krishna themes. Even if they don't mention Krishna, we can feel this is Vaishnava poetry. Most of the scholar claims that Bharatchandra was Shakta, but as his king. But we know he was as ascetic in Puri, as a Vaishnava. And it's very evident that this poetry, if you know Vaishnava poetry of Bengal, this is example of very beautiful Vaishnava poetry. And he puts it, in the Shakta poem, and he plays with that very nicely. And that's what I mentioned, that he sometimes is very ironic towards the court, because you can feel this interplay, that there is this irony, that, sometimes he shows the court in a different light. But it's very easy. I mean, when I show these examples of love-making scenes to my colleague who specialized in Sanskrit erotic poetry. For her, it was just typical Sanskrit description of lovemaking, nothing unusual. For Bengali readers, it was something very unusual during that time. So he was very bold with that, and you will not find these kind of examples of eroticism in other works of the poets that I read. So I don't know if I answer your question, but it feels, especially the second part, it's full of adirasa, it's full of, as it's called, Shringararasa. It's completely full of adirasa, and that kind of aesthetic sentiments were very common probably till the first part of the 19th century, when suddenly Victorian moralists and also Bengali moralists had already problem with that kind of explicit description of lovemaking. So probably it would be nicer for them to see that we use technical terms, what they did, than have this vivid description of lovemaking. But I have never read any other work from that period that gives that description. Of course, in Rampras, I read the Ramprasad Sen's edition, just to finish answering the question. It's written very differently, but he is also quite explicit. He gives the description of lovemaking, long one. So it was not uncommon. That was still the aesthetic sensibility of the period, I think.
Well, thank you, everyone, both online and in this hall, and of course, thank you, Dr. Panashuk, for bringing us this extraordinary lecture.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me once again, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.